The next time you get a pounding headache, you'll probably open a plastic bottle, pop two painkillers, and go right back to your day. You won't think twice about it. You'll assume that pill was invented by a scientist in a white lab coat. Except it wasn't. The active chemical keeping you comfortable right now wasn't born in a modern laboratory. It was pulled off a tree in the North American forest thousands of years ago by indigenous healers. Long before hospitals, sterile operating rooms, or antibiotics existed, Native Americans were surviving brutal sicknesses, setting shattered bones, and curing deadly infections in conditions that should have killed them. Getting sick 800 years ago in the untamed wilderness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was an immediate death sentence, unless your tribe knew how to fight back. And what they did was so surprisingly advanced that when European explorers first landed in the Americas, their own university-trained doctors were terrified and humbled by how much better indigenous healers were at keeping people alive. How did human beings with no microscopes, no chemical labs, and no modern tech conquer disease in the wild? The story of how Native Americans survived sickness is stranger, darker, and far more brilliant than anything they taught you in history class, and it will change the way you see the medicine in your cabinet forever. Let's start with something that sounds like sci-fi for its time. If you had a deep infected wound 500 years ago in Europe, a doctor would likely burn it with boiling oil or cut your limb off without anesthesia. But deep in the North American continent, indigenous healers were doing something completely different. They invented the world's first crude syringe. Long before hypodermic needles were patented in the 1800s, indigenous healers took the hollow, thin bones of birds, attached them to animal bladders, and created a pressure system. They used these devices to wash out deep, bacteria-ridden wounds with sterile herbal antiseptics and inject liquid medicine directly into infection sites. When bones broke, they didn't just leave you to limp. They crafted flexible casts out of specialized clay, wet hide, and tree bark that hardened perfectly around the limb as it dried, setting bones so accurately that modern forensic archaeologists still marvel at the healed skeletons. This wasn't primitive guesswork, it was specialized, high-level medicine. But surgery was only their last resort. Their real superpower was hidden in the dirt. Long before laboratories synthesized drugs, indigenous Americans spent thousands of years conducting the longest, most dangerous clinical trial in human history. Through trial, error, and thousands of deaths. In the winter of 1535, a French explorer named Jacques Cartier and his crew were trapped in ice near modern-day Montreal. Scurvy struck. The sailors' gums rotted, their skin turned black, and their legs swelled. They were dying fast. The local Haudenosaunee people saw the dying men and brought them a tea made from the boiled bark and needles of an evergreen tree they called aneda. Within days of drinking it, the sailors were fully cured. Cartier called it a miracle. Today, we know the tree was packed with massive doses of vitamin C and anti-inflammatory compounds. And it didn't stop there. When Native Americans had severe headaches, fevers, or joint pain, they chewed the inner bark of the willow tree. The active ingredient? Salicin, the exact natural compound Bayer turned into aspirin centuries later. When they had deep skin infections or snake bites, they crushed echinacea, a plant modern science now proves stimulates white blood cell production. For persistent coughs, they boiled wild cherry bark, which is still a primary ingredient in modern cough syrups today. Over 60% of all modern plant-derived medicines in use today were originally discovered and utilized by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. You aren't taking modern medicine, you're taking ancient indigenous discoveries wrapped in modern plastic. Now here's where their understanding of human biology gets mind-blowing. When you get sick today, what's the first thing you do? You take medication to bring down a fever. But modern science has recently admitted something controversial. Aggressively suppressing a fever can actually prolong an infection. Fever is your immune system turning up the heat to cook pathogens that cannot survive at high temperatures. Native Americans understood this thousands of years ago. When someone was sick with a deep internal infection, they didn't cool them down. They built sweat lodges, inipi. They brought red-hot stones into a sealed dome, poured water infused with medicinal plants like sage and cedar over the rocks, and subjected the patient to intense controlled heat and therapeutic steam. It was biological warfare inside the human body.
The intense heat artificially induced hyperthermia, triggering heat shock proteins and boosting white blood cell activity, while the inhaled plant steam cleared the lungs and killed airborne bacteria. They didn't know what a pathogen was under a microscope, but they knew how to make the human body an unlivable environment for disease.
But who carried all this knowledge? Who remembered which root cured hemorrhage and which leaf killed you in 5 minutes? The medicine keeper. In indigenous society, the medicine man or medicine woman wasn't just a religious figure. They were the living medical library of the tribe. Because these cultures relied on oral history, a healer had to memorize hundreds of plant species, exact seasonal harvest times, toxic dosages, and surgical steps entirely in their heads. To keep these complex chemical recipes from being forgotten, they coded them directly into sacred chants and songs. The rhythm of a song wasn't just ritual, it was a precise timer used to boil roots for the exact number of minutes required to extract medicine without ruining it. Some nations, like the Ojibwe, even created secret medical guilds that etched detailed anatomical maps onto birch bark scrolls. They were trained through decades of brutal apprenticeship. They understood that sickness wasn't just physical, it was mental and social. They treated the individual with plants, the mind with ritual, and the environment with care. If a tribe member was sick, the entire community sat with them, fed them, and held space for them. Care was communal. No one was left to die alone. Losing a healer wasn't just a tragedy. It was like a modern university burning to the ground in a single day. And now, here's the darkest chapter of this story. For thousands of years, this medical system worked remarkably well. Native Americans had conquered the natural diseases of their continent. Then came the late 15th century. When Europeans arrived, they brought something no indigenous medicine keeper had ever seen: old world pathogens like smallpox, measles, and typhus. Because indigenous Americans had been isolated for over 10,000 years, their immune systems had zero genetic antibodies against these microscopic invaders. The herbal remedies that had cured fevers and infections for millennia suddenly failed. The sweat lodges, so effective against local respiratory bugs, actually made smallpox worse. Imagine the psychological nightmare for the medicine keepers. For the first time in history, every root, tea, and sacred song completely failed them. Entire villages were depopulated in a matter of weeks, dying so fast that healers didn't even have time to study the new disease or train new apprentices. It is estimated that within 150 years of contact, up to 90% of the indigenous population died, not primarily from steel or gunpowder, but from microscopic biological weapons they had no time to adapt to. Along with millions of human lives, thousands of years of accumulated medical knowledge vanished overnight as the living libraries, the healers, died alongside their people. Here's what makes all of this deeply profound. Despite the loss, despite the devastation, the thread was never completely broken. Even today, top pharmaceutical researchers are quietly turning back to indigenous knowledge, scouring wild landscapes for the next generation of antibiotics and cancer therapies hidden in plants healers used for millennia. The white walls of modern laboratories didn't replace ancient wisdom, they were built directly on top of it. Indigenous medicine wasn't just primitive survival, it was the ultimate proof of human brilliance and resilience against impossible odds. Because at its core, medicine was never just chemicals, formulas, or clinical trials. In its original form, medicine was memory. It was the collective survival instinct of a species refusing to let each other suffer alone in the dark. Modern science gave us mass production, but indigenous healers gave us the foundation. Every pill bottle on Earth carries an invisible debt to the people who mapped the living pharmacy of this planet, long before we ever understood what a molecule was. The next time you open a bottle of cough syrup, put witch hazel on a burn, or swallow an aspirin for a headache, you are not engaging with modern technology. You are completing a line of memory that stretches back thousands of years into the forests, plains, and mountains of North America. Back to a healer crouched by a fire, crushing roots into clay, using a hollow bone to wash out a wound, and passing that life-saving knowledge forward. We didn't invent medicine in a laboratory. We inherited it from people who listened to the earth when their lives depended on it.